right. So being someone who is a trauma worker, I can't help but notice that we've heard a few heavy stories in here tonight. I don't know if anyone else is feeling that in your body, but I know that I am. So forgive me for being a rape crisis advocate every chance I get, but if you want to just take a minute and feel your feet on the ground and your butt in the seat and air in your lungs and just take a minute to see how you feel. I know I needed a deep breath. Maybe you do too. You want to take one with me now? All right, let's do that real quick. And I know we've heard a recurring theme throughout this about how hard it is for us to love our bodies, and it just seems like that's something that we all struggle with, and so I feel compelled at this moment to disclose, even though I wasn't planning to, that I practiced this talk today in a Skype chat partially disrobed. And I love every inch of this body. Not a piece of it, no matter what size it is, that is not sacred, and there's not a piece of you, whatever size you are, that is not sacred, and that is my disclaimer before I start my story. I didn't even mean to say that. The spirit fell on me. What I plan to tell you was that when I was 15 years old, my high school crammed us into this tiny little classroom off the end of our basketball gym for the much-awaited sex ed portion of health class. I blessedly do not remember very much of that class, but what I do remember is that there was this page in the curriculum that had a list of clever ways to say no, such as, "Hey baby, want to get in the back seat?" "No thanks, I'd rather stay up here with you." What? It was the dumbest class ever, and we talked about like reproductive systems and body parts and STIs and pregnancy and childbirth, and every time any of us would ask like an uncomfortable question like, "How do you keep from getting pregnant?" they'd say, "That sounds like an excellent question to ask your parents." And I had heard enough pop culture references to the talk by that point to know that it's a thing that's supposed to happen, so eventually I sat my mom down and I was like, "So, hey mom, like, aren't we gonna have some kind of sex talk?" And without saying a word, my mom left the room, and when she came back, she handed me her copy of A Child is Born, which is a book I had already been thumbing through for years, like you do when your parents have books with naked people in them. And so if you're not familiar with this book, it's got all of these exquisite pictures of pregnancy from inside the womb and of childbirth, basically nothing at all in it about safe sex, nothing about consent, nothing about communication, nothing at all that is practical for a sexually inexperienced teenager. And so for the most part, I didn't talk about sex anymore for a couple of years because I was not having any sex in high school. Don't mock my pain, I'm not kidding. And then the summer between my junior and senior year of high school, I went to governor's school, which is basically a 6-week-long summer camp for nerds. And I'm not saying that being a giant nerd is the reason I didn't have any sex in high school, but let's just say everybody thought I was the kind of dweeb that was never gonna get laid. I showed them. Anyway, at governor's school, one of the enrichment activities they did was they had an HIV awareness and safe sex talk that was given by this guy named Scott. I still remember his name. And he was a gay man and an activist with ACT UP Chicago. Yay, early 90s. Anyway, at that enrichment class, he gave us so many good ideas, and we all left so inspired that we went home and we started this underground newsletter at our school, and we called it The Enlightenment, because even though we were giant nerds, we were totally full of shit because we were 17. And so we started this underground newsletter, and every issue of The Enlightenment, I have to say it that way and you do too now, every issue had a sex ed feature. And between my contacts at governor's school and a few renegade teachers helping me out, within a few months we had it at like more than 20 schools across the state. And then I heard that our school board was going to expel whoever was responsible for it, which was basically the entire AP and honors program at Myrtle Beach High. Go Seahawks! So we ceased publication, but the activist fire had already been lit, in me at least. And by the time I had my first child, I had already come out as bisexual. We didn't really have a framework then for pansexual or non-binary, at least not in the circles I was in. And I did a whole lot of LGBTQ organizing and activism. And then I settled into a long-term relationship with a cis guy. And by erasure being what it is, I felt edged out of my queer activism by the L's and the G's. And the gender identity dialogue being what it was at the time, I had already been edged out of any genderqueer identity by vag-phobic cis gay men, like they sometimes do. And so I settled down into a very sweet, very heartwarming, appallingly heteronormative, but otherwise lovely life with my partner, and we went on to add a few more children to the one that I came into our relationship with. And like good aware parents, we knew there's like layers and layers of the sex talk, starting with things like proper names for body parts and asking permission for hugs, and we did all that stuff. But with each of our kids, there came a point where we had like the talk, you know, like the big one where you talk about like what your genitals can do. I don't know what that was. Plenty more where that came from. Anyway, by the time we got around to the talk with my first kid, we had moved to this very small, conservative, evangelical town in rural South Carolina, and I was doing what I thought I had to do to keep my kids and my family safe, which is pretty much hide behind a lot of privilege. But I was still determined this was going to be a good talk. And I was going to do what had to be done, say what had to be said. I was going to do it without giggling and without using stupid made-up names for body parts and without flinching. And when I said penis in vagina without flinching and followed it up with some talk about STIs and pregnancy prevention and safe sex, I was pretty proud of myself. By the time we got around to the talk with my second child, we had moved to Chapel Hill. By that point, I was a dedicated rape crisis volunteer, answering hotlines, thank you, answering hotlines and providing hospital accompaniment to sit with rape survivors through their rape kits. I had gotten more in touch with my feminist activism, and I was all about decentering marriage and babies, and I thought this was going to be a great talk. And I said penis in vagina without flinching, and I talked about how sex could be for pleasure, not just function. And I talked about masturbation and how it feels great and there's nothing wrong with it. And we talked about orientation and how people love and like to have sex with whoever feels right for them. And we talked about pregnancy prevention and STIs and barriers, and we talked about how there's all sorts of things beyond penis and vagina sex that people can do for fun, although I admittedly did not go into a lot of detail about what those were. And when we finished, my kid was appropriately mortified and mesmerized. And I was so pleased with myself, and nobody else on that Noodles and Company patio that day had any idea what had just happened 2 tables over. By the time we got around to that talk with my third child, I was starting to get a lot more connected to my queer identity. And in addition to my hotline work at the Rape Crisis Center, I had started leading the Sexuality and Intimacy After Abuse and Assault group, which is basically, yay! All right, I don't know who here in here is an advocate too, but thank you. That group is basically a hybrid between a support group and a sex ed and communications class for survivors of child sexual abuse and assault. And I knew this talk was going to be a good one, and it was. I said penis in vagina without flinching after qualifying that that is a common thing in heterosexual partnerships. And we talked about masturbation being normal, and we talked about barriers and STIs and pregnancy prevention, and we talked about orientation and identity, and we talked about how to know when you have consent, and we talked about how to know when you're ready to have sex, and basically we talked about all the things we had with my other kids plus some, and we had a really good conversation about how sometimes beyond yes and no, people might have sex with someone because they're scared their partner won't love them anymore, it might leave them if they don't, and how it's really not fair to put that kind of pressure on a partner. And all in all, it was a really good talk, and I was really pleased with myself yet again. By the time I got around to the talk with my last children, twins, my older 2 children, their older 2 siblings had gone through Planned Parenthood's Peer Sexual Health Educator Program. Yay, yay teen connections. My second child had come out as non-binary. I was fully immersed in my queer identity and orientation and community yet again. And I had just finished an interdisciplinary master's degree that focused on global human rights, social justice, and gender theory. This talk was not going to be at all heteronormative or cisnormative, and I was sure as shit not going to be cis-heteropatriarchy's puppet. You can all see where this is going. Buckle up. Because I told my 10-year-old twins that when someone with a penis who could have any gender identity is sexual with someone with a vagina who could also have any gender identity, that there are any number of things they might choose to do together. And we talked about mouths and fingers and genitals and skin and all the things that might be rubbed or put somewhere or take something in. And I talked about how whether or not it's two people with penises or two with vaginas or one of each or a few of each, that there's all sorts of stuff that they might choose to do together, and that penis and anything sex is not the end-all be-all of a good fucking time. And when I said penis and vagina without flinching, my twins didn't flinch either, because they had already been making this somewhat mortified, half-dazed, half-zombie face for like 10 minutes already. And we talked about all sorts of things that people could do involving genitals and how they might need different kinds of barrier protection for each one to keep it safe. Yeah. And when my twins said stuff to me like, "Oh God, Mom, ow, ow," I was like, "There's this thing called lube." We talked about consent and how to avoid accidental boundary violations and safe sex and how to listen to your partner and how to talk about things. And then we had this amazing conversation about cultural messages about our bodies and our sexuality and how to think critically about them and how to counter their impact in our own behaviors and words and minds. And when I finished, my twins left the room and my partner and I sat there silent. And after a minute he says, "That was your best work yet." And I was like, "Hell yeah, it was!" And a couple minutes later, my then 15-year-old came into the room and he's like, "Mom, I don't know what you just said, but the twins are in the living room and they're talking about dental dams and butt sex and lube. So I say, go you." And he gave me a fist bump. Did I say too much? Did I go too far? No. I mean, I don't know. Do any of us know? Like really, how far is too far when our kids' health and safety and well-being and ability to feel comfortable in their own bodies is on the line? Yeah. How far is too far when every freaking message they're hearing in this culture is telling them to ignore their gut feelings, to hate their bodies, to not ask for what they need, and to not say no to what they don't want or need? I know I said too much. We're all just doing the best we can. I went overboard, as is sometimes my nature. And I know without a doubt that I probably said things that day that 10-year-olds just don't need to hear quite yet. But I also know that when I'm talking to my children about one of the most intimate ways that they can love their bodies, I would rather go too far than not far enough. Every damn time.